today we go into what they're calling lockdown 2.0, full tier 4 lockdown for the entire country or the United Kingdom. And there's a lot of people watching from around the world. Is this the best decision from an economic perspective, in your opinion? And what are some of the costs that this will lead to?
Well, I think relative to the first lockdown, which came in the UK, starting toward the end of March and ended up actually lasting almost 3 months, if it does turn out to be 1 month, then pretty obviously the economic damage and costs that will do, and indeed the sort of knock-on mental health costs, would be proportionately lower than the 3-month lockdown. So at least there's the prospect that it may last significantly less than the lockdown that started toward the end of March. Whether or not this one is justified, I think is a tricky judgment. Clearly, we're in a very difficult position in the UK right now. There are no easy ways forward. The infection has increased a lot. And I'm sure Sage is right that there is a significant risk of hospitals being overwhelmed in some parts of the country. Whether or not a national lockdown, one thing we do know is that the infection is running at different rates in different parts of the UK. Whether a sort of national lockdown is the optimal strategy is somewhat less obvious. But at least if it were in place for 4 weeks, and that does bring down the infection rate rapidly, and then we could start easing the restrictions and go back to something which is a bit more differentiated by region of the UK, that would be a less damaging way forward than what we had that ran through March, April, and most of May and into June.
Right. No, I understand it would be less. I'm just trying to also try to quantify what this will actually mean, because we keep, we know that, for example, the hospitality sector was kind of barely hanging on. We know that certain businesses were just starting to make a comeback, but now a lot of them have said this extra month is going to put them out of business. Now, it's one thing to hear the anecdotal stories of people losing their businesses, but it's great to have an economist like you to talk and to say, well, how is that going to actually quantify into lives lost, changes in mental health over the coming years? Is there any way to explain what that is to people?
Well, there's a lot of evidence that if restrictions that we're about to see in the UK were to cost substantial numbers of jobs, because some firms, as you say, are on the brink already, and another 4 or 5 weeks might mean that they just don't reopen, and therefore you lose jobs, not just for a month or two, but maybe permanently. We do know that the cost of a big reduction in employment, which is likely to last for a substantial period, is very large. So one of my colleagues at Imperial College, very eminent public health economist called Carol Proper, she recently produced some analysis, I think it's very careful analysis, which would suggest that if you go back to the financial crisis and the scale of job losses in the UK back then, in the aftermath of September, October 2008, the job losses that we saw in the UK back then, she estimates, increased the number of people with chronic health conditions by something like 900,000. And they become chronic health conditions with obviously an enormous health and welfare cost stretching far into the future. And that those were employment losses on the scale that we saw in 2008, 2009. Right now, employment in the UK is probably down since the pandemic started by at least as much as that. So it's very clear that if you have employment costs that are large, the long-term damage that does to the welfare of people in the country is absolutely enormous. That bit, I think, is very clear. I think what's a little bit more difficult to work out right now, given that the infection rates have moved up a lot in a short period, and there is no doubt a risk of hospitals being overwhelmed in some parts of the country, whether a strategy short of a lockdown would end up generating such panic in the short run that you'd end up with something as bad as a 4-week lockdown anyway. So I guess where I come down on all this is that if what we see right now in the UK is really a short, sharp lockdown that succeeds in bringing the infection rate down quickly and we can ease restrictions back in much of the country within 3 or 4 weeks, that may well be a sensible strategy. On the other hand, if this is a lockdown where we think we need to keep this in place more or less indefinitely until a vaccine comes along, I think it's likely to be a very, very damaging strategy, and one which would not pass any sensible cost-benefit analysis. So the question is, what is it we're about to embark on in the UK? Is it really the short, sharp 3 or 4 weeks? Or is it a more open-ended thing that we end up needing to keep in place, or at least the government thinks we need to keep in place for much longer? And I think it's very unlikely that that second sort of lockdown would pass any kind of sensible cost-benefit analysis.